Traoré visits forgotten village, and an elder reveals a prophecy that changes everything. The presidential convoy stirred clouds of red dust as it wound through the narrow dirt road toward Bangassé. Captain Ibrahim Traoré gazed out the reinforced window, watching the landscape gradually transform from the bustling outskirts of Ouagadougou to the sparse settlements of rural Burkina Faso. This remote village, nestled between rocky outcroppings in the country's eastern province, had been absent from government maps for over 2 decades. "Are you certain about this detour, Mr. President?" asked Colonel Caboret, his chief security officer, glancing nervously at his watch. "The Chinese mining delegation expects your arrival in Fata Ngourma by evening." Traoré shifted in his seat, his military fatigues already showing patches of perspiration despite the vehicle's air conditioning. At 34, the young leader had developed a reputation for spontaneous decisions that often frustrated his carefully planned schedules. "The Chinese have waited months for these negotiations. They can wait a few more hours." The decision to visit Bangassé had come to him suddenly that morning, prompted by a handwritten letter delivered to the presidential palace by an elderly courier who had walked 70 kilometers from the village. The letter, written in careful French on yellowed paper, contained a simple but urgent request: "Come see what your people have preserved while the world forgot us." Lieutenant Colonel Ouedraogo, seated across from the president, reviewed security briefings on his tablet. "Sir, our intelligence indicates the village has a population of approximately 300 people. No recorded incidents of terrorist activity, but also no government presence whatsoever. No health clinic, no school, no administrative post, which is precisely why we need to be here," Traoré replied, his voice carrying the conviction that had driven his rise to power 18 months earlier. "These are the people we claim to serve, yet we've served them only with neglect." As the convoy crested a small hill, Bangassé appeared in the valley below, a cluster of traditional round huts with thatched roofs, surrounded by sparse fields of struggling millet and sorghum. Despite the obvious poverty, the village possessed an undeniable dignity. Ancient baobab trees provided shade for gathering areas, and carefully maintained stone walls marked property boundaries that spoke of generations of careful stewardship. More remarkable was the reception awaiting them. Every villager, from elderly men in traditional robes to children in faded school uniforms, had assembled along the single main path. Colorful fabrics had been strung between trees, and women held palm fronds that they waved in traditional welcome. The preparation suggested they had known of his arrival despite no advance communication. "How did they know we were coming?" Colonel Caboret muttered, his hand instinctively moving to his sidearm. Traoré noticed the security chief's tension and placed a calming hand on his shoulder. "Perhaps they've simply learned to hope for the impossible." When the vehicles came to a stop in the village center, Traoré emerged to find himself facing a delegation of elders, led by a man whose weathered face spoke of decades under the harsh Sahel sun. The village chief, draped in a magnificent indigo boubou, stepped forward with dignified composure. "Welcome, son of Burkina Faso," the chief intoned, his voice carrying across the silent crowd. "I am Hamadou Caboret, guardian of Bangassé for 37 seasons. We have waited long for this day." Traoré accepted the traditional greeting, clasping the elder's hands in both of his own. "The waiting ends today, Chief Caboret, though I fear I come bearing more questions than answers." The chief smiled enigmatically. "Questions are the beginning of all understanding, Mr. President. Come, there is someone who has been expecting you longer than you might imagine." As they walked deeper into the village, Traoré observed details that spoke of remarkable resilience. Solar panels, clearly salvaged and repaired multiple times, powered a small workshop where young men crafted tools from scrap metal. Women tended gardens that somehow flourished despite the arid conditions, their irrigation systems revealing sophisticated understanding of water conservation. Children played games with toys made from recycled materials, their laughter bright against the backdrop of hardship. "Your people have accomplished much without government assistance," Traoré observed to the chief. "We have had help," the elder replied cryptically, "though not from the sources you might expect." They approached a hut that stood apart from the others, distinguished by intricate painted designs around its entrance and strings of what appeared to be ancient beads hanging from the doorframe. An indefinable sense of reverence emanated from the structure, and even the children who had been following the presidential procession fell silent as they drew near. "She has been waiting for you specifically," Chief Traoré said quietly. "Though she is 96 years old and has never left this village, she knew you would come. She even knew the day." From within the hut emerged a figure that seemed to embody the very essence of time itself. The woman was tiny, her dark skin wrinkled like ancient leather, her white hair carefully braided with cowrie shells. Despite her obvious age, her movements possessed a fluid grace, and her eyes, clouded with cataracts, somehow seemed to see everything with perfect clarity. "Ibrahim Traoré," she said, her voice surprisingly strong for her apparent frailty. "The one who carries the burden of Sankara's dreams. I am Mariama Traoré, and I have been waiting for you for 37 years. A profound silence settled over the gathering as the ancient woman's words hung in the still air. President Traoré felt an inexplicable chill despite the afternoon heat, his rational mind struggling to process the impossible claim. Colonel Traoré stepped closer, his trained instincts alert to any potential threat, while the villagers maintained respectful distance from what was clearly a moment of extraordinary significance. "You share my family name, grandmother," Traoré said carefully, using the honorific that showed respect for her age and status. "But I don't understand how you could have been waiting for me specifically." Mariama's weathered face creased into what might have been a smile. "Sit with me, child of destiny. The sun grows fierce, and old bones prefer shade for the sharing of ancient truths." She gestured toward a carved wooden stool beside her hut, and despite his security detail's visible discomfort, Traoré found himself moving to comply. Something about the elderly woman's presence commanded respect that transcended normal protocols. As he settled onto the simple seat, she lowered herself onto a woven mat with surprising grace. 37 years ago, Mariama began, her voice taking on the rhythmic cadence of traditional storytelling. "On the day Thomas Sankara breathed his last breath in Ouagadougou, the spirits of our ancestors spoke to me in a vision. They showed me a young man who would be born in that same hour, carrying the revolutionary's unfulfilled dreams in his heart." Traoré's composure faltered slightly. He had indeed been born on October 15, 1987, the exact day of Sankara's assassination, a coincidence that had shaped his worldview from the moment he learned of it in his teenage years. "They revealed his name," the elder continued, "and the village where his journey would begin. They showed me the moment when he would arrive at this forgotten place, seeking something he could not yet name. Most importantly, they warned me of the choice he would face, a choice that would determine not just his fate, but the destiny of our entire nation." Lieutenant Colonel Ouedraogo shifted nervously, checking his watch. The planned schedule was already severely compromised, and each passing minute added complexity to their security arrangement. But Traoré seemed entirely absorbed by the elderly woman's words, leaning forward with an intensity that his staff rarely witnessed outside of critical military briefings. "What choice?" the president asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Mariama reached into the folds of her traditional wrapper and withdrew a small object wrapped in faded cloth. Unwrapping it with reverent care, she revealed an ancient brass pendant suspended on a leather cord, its surface covered with symbols that seemed to shift and flow in the dappled sunlight filtering through the baobab leaves. "This has been in my family's keeping for 5 generations, she explained. "My great-grandmother received it from a stranger who appeared in this village during the Great Drought of 1912. He spoke of a time when the people of this land would face their greatest trial, and a young leader would emerge to guide them through the darkness." She held the pendant toward the light, and Traoré could see that the symbols were not random decorations but carefully crafted representations: stars, crescents, human figures, and geometric patterns that seemed to tell a story beyond his immediate comprehension. The stranger said that when the rightful bearer came to claim it, the pendant would choose him, Mariama continued. "For over a century my family has guarded this trust, waiting for the one whose arrival was foretold." Colonel Traoré stepped forward, his professional skepticism overriding diplomatic courtesy. "Mr. President, with respect, we should consider—" "Wait," Traoré interrupted, his eyes never leaving the pendant. Something about the artifact drew him with inexplicable force. The rational part of his mind catalogued it as merely an interesting piece of traditional craft, but deeper instincts responded to something far more profound. "May I?" he asked, extending his hand. Mariama nodded and placed the pendant in his palm. The moment the brass touched his skin, Traoré felt a shock of something. Not electricity, but a sense of connection that seemed to reach back through generations of history. The weight felt both familiar and momentous, as if he were reclaiming something long lost rather than encountering it for the first time. "It recognizes you," the elder observed with satisfaction. "As I knew it would." Around them, the villagers had grown increasingly still, watching with expressions of awe and anticipation. Even his security details seemed affected by the moment's gravity, their usual vigilance tempered by recognition that they were witnessing something beyond their training parameters. "Tell me about this choice," Traoré said, his fingers closing around the pendant. "What decision must I make?" Mariama's expression grew grave. "In 3 moons' time, when the rains should come but do not, you will face a moment that will define everything. Your closest advisors will present you with 2 paths, one that preserves your power but betrays your principles, another that upholds your values but risks everything you have built." She paused, her clouded eyes somehow finding and holding his gaze with unsettling intensity. "The spirits showed me both futures, child. In one, Burkina Faso becomes a beacon of hope for all Africa, leading other nations toward true independence and prosperity. In the other," her voice trailed off ominously. "In the other?" Traoré prompted. "In the other, the dreams of Sankara die forever, and our people remain trapped in cycles of dependency and conflict that will span generations." The weight of her words settled over the gathering like a physical presence. Traoré felt the pendant growing warm against his palm, and for a moment he could almost see the futures she described, one bright with possibility, the other shadowed with despair. "How can I know which choice is right?" he asked. "When the moment comes," Mariama replied, "the pendant will grow cold if you move toward darkness, warm if you choose the path of light. But remember, the choice must come from your heart, not from the guidance of any token. The pendant merely confirms what your soul already knows." Chief Traoré approached respectfully. "Grandmother Mariama has never been wrong in her visions," he said to Traoré. "She foresaw the great drought of 2004, 3 years before it arrived. She predicted the fall of President Compaoré to the exact month. Her words carry the weight of truth." Traoré looked down at the pendant, then back at the ancient woman. "If I accept this burden, what am I committing to?" "To being worthy of the dreams that brought you to power," she replied simply. "To remembering that true leadership serves not the leader, but the led. To choosing courage over comfort when the moment of testing arrives." Ew! As the afternoon sun began its descent toward the horizon, painting the village in shades of amber and gold, Mariama gestured for Traoré to follow her into her hut. His security detail tensed immediately, but the president raised a hand to forestall their objection. Something about this encounter had moved beyond the realm of normal protocols into territory where different rules applied. The interior of the hut was surprisingly spacious, its walls lined with shelves holding clay vessels, bundles of dried herbs, and scrolls that looked far older than the village itself. The air was thick with the scent of incense and age, creating an atmosphere that seemed to exist outside ordinary time. Weak sunlight filtered through small openings, illuminating dust motes that danced like spirits in the golden beams. "Sit," Mariama instructed, indicating a low stool carved from dark wood. She settled herself on a mat woven in intricate patterns that seemed to shift in the changing light. Between them, she placed a collection of objects, stones, shells, and small metal tokens that gleamed dully in the shadows. "The vision came to me in stages," she began, her voice taking on the hypnotic quality of ancient oral tradition. "First, I saw the birth of the one who would carry forward the revolutionary flame. The spirits showed me a child born as Sankara's blood watered the earth, destined to inherit both his dreams and his trials." Traoré remained silent, though every word resonated with details of his own life that no stranger could possibly know. "They revealed the path that would bring you to power, through military service, through growing disillusionment with corruption, through the moment when duty would compel you to act against those who had betrayed the people's trust. The accuracy was unsettling. His journey from idealistic young officer to coup leader had followed exactly the pattern she described, driven by witnessing the systematic theft of resources while citizens suffered. But the spirits also showed me the great test that awaits, Mariama continued, reaching for a leather pouch that lay beside her mat. From it, she withdrew a handful of cowrie shells and scattered them across the space between them. Though they fell randomly, her expression suggested she perceived meaningful patterns in their arrangement. 3 challenges will come in rapid succession, she said, studying the shells with the intensity of one reading sacred text. First, you will face pressure to abandon your principles in exchange for international support. Powerful nations will offer weapons and money, but their price will be the surrender of your independence. Traoré thought of the recent overtures from various world powers, each promising aid in exchange for concessions that would effectively return Burkina Faso to colonial status under new management. The second challenge will come from within, Mariama continued. Those closest to you will present evidence of threats to your life and power. They will urge preemptive action against perceived enemies, action that would transform you from liberator to oppressor. Again, the prophecy aligned with current realities. His intelligence chief had recently presented reports of potential coup plots, recommending arrests and exile for various opposition figures. And the third challenge? Traoré asked, though part of him dreaded the answer. The third will test the very core of who you are, she replied gravely. You will be offered the chance to secure your legacy and position for decades to come. The price will seem small, merely the postponement of promises made to the people. But this delay will become permanent, and the revolutionary will become the dictator. She gathered the shells and returned them to their pouch before fixing him with her unseeing gaze. Each test will seem reasonable, even necessary. Your advisors will present compelling arguments for compromise. But remember, the spirits showed me both paths clearly. What did they show you? Traoré asked, though he sensed the answer would change everything. Mariama stood and moved to a carved wooden chest that sat against the far wall. From it, she withdrew 2 objects, a withered branch and a green shoot barely emerging from rich soil. If you fail the tests, she said, holding up the dead branch, this is Burkina Faso's future. Not immediate collapse, but gradual decay. Your revolution will become just another failed attempt at change, and our people will sink deeper into the despair that breeds violence and dependency. She set down the branch and held up the green shoot. But if you remain true to your principles, if you choose the hard path of genuine liberation, this is what awaits. Not easy prosperity, but sustainable growth. Not immediate security, but lasting peace. Not personal power, but collective empowerment. Traoré reached out to touch the green shoot, marveling at its vitality despite having been severed from its source. How can I be certain I'll recognize the right choice when the moment comes? Because you will be alone when it matters most, Mariama replied. The tests will come when your advisors are absent, when the comfortable voices of compromise are silent. In those moments of solitude, you will hear either the whispers of ambition or the call of conscience. The pendant will help you distinguish between them. She returned to her mat and withdrew one final item from her chest, a scroll so old that its edges crumbled at her touch. Unrolling it carefully, she revealed text written in what appeared to be Arabic script, interspersed with symbols similar to those on the pendant. This contains the full prophecy, she explained, recorded by the stranger who brought the pendant to my family. I cannot read the ancient words, but their meaning has been passed down through oral tradition. When your trials begin, return here. The true understanding will come only when you need it most. Outside, Colonel Caboret's voice carried through the walls, reminding his president of the approaching darkness and the need to reach their destination before nightfall. The practical world was reasserting its demands, pulling him back from this timeless space where prophecy and possibility converged. Will I see you again, grandmother? Traoré asked as he prepared to leave. Mariama smiled with serene acceptance. The spirits show me many things, child, but not the hour of my own departure. Know only this: you carry forward the hopes of generations. The pendant will remind you of that burden, but the strength to bear it must come from within. As he stood to leave, She grasped his wrist with surprising strength. Remember, true revolution is not the seizure of power, but its transformation. You have taken control of government. Now you must revolutionize the very concept of leadership itself. Traoré emerged from the hut to find the entire village assembled in respectful silence, their faces reflecting a mixture of hope and solemnity. The pendant hung warm against his chest, hidden beneath his uniform, but somehow radiating significance that seemed to touch everyone present. "Thank you," he said simply, addressing Mariama but speaking to the entire community. "I will not forget what I have learned here." "See that you do not," the ancient woman replied. "For all our sakes." The journey back to Ouagadougou passed in contemplative silence, broken only by the occasional radio check from the security escort vehicles. Traoré sat with the pendant concealed beneath his uniform, its weight both comforting and ominous as the prophecy's implications settled into his consciousness. Colonel Caboret attempted several times to engage him in discussion about security protocols, but the president remained absorbed in thoughts that seemed to carry him far beyond the confines of the armored vehicle. "Sir," Lieutenant Colonel Ouedraogo finally ventured as they approached the capital's outskirts, "the Chinese delegation is requesting confirmation of tomorrow's breakfast meeting. They're particularly eager to discuss the lithium mining concession." Traoré stirred from his reverie, the mention of the Chinese delegation suddenly taking on new significance in light of Mariama's warnings about foreign pressures. "Postpone the meeting," he said quietly. "I need time to review our position." "Sir, they've traveled specifically for these negotiations," his aide pressed. "Canceling could be interpreted as diplomatic hostility." "Then let them interpret it as they will," Traoré replied with newfound resolve. "We will not be rushed into decisions that affect our nation's future, simply to accommodate foreign schedules." The pendant seemed to pulse with warmth against his chest, subtle confirmation that he was beginning to understand the choices ahead. Over the following weeks, that understanding would be tested, as the prophecy's first elements began to manifest with unsettling accuracy. The initial test came disguised as opportunity. Ambassador Chen Wei, representing Beijing's interests, requested a private audience where he laid out a comprehensive package of military assistance, infrastructure development, and economic support. The price seemed reasonable: exclusive rights to newly discovered lithium deposits and guaranteed access to strategic minerals for 30 years. "President Traoré," the ambassador said with polished diplomacy, "China seeks only mutually beneficial partnerships. Our support comes without the political conditions that Western nations typically impose. We respect your sovereignty completely." Sitting across from the Chinese official in his modest office, Traoré felt the pendant grow noticeably cooler against his skin. The sensation was so distinct that he briefly wondered if the ambassador could see his reaction. But Chen continued speaking with smooth confidence. "The lithium reserves in your eastern provinces could transform Burkina Faso's economy," Chen pressed. "With our investment and technology, you could become the primary supplier for the entire African renewable energy sector. The revenue would fund all your development goals." "And in exchange?" Traoré asked, though he already knew the answer would confirm Mariama's prophecy. "Simply guaranteed access to the resources," Chen replied. "A fair price, of course, but with priority delivery to Chinese manufacturers. Consider it an investment in your nation's future prosperity." Traoré stood and walked to his window, gazing out at the bustling streets of Ouagadougou. Below, vendors sold goods from wooden carts, children played in dusty courtyards, and ordinary citizens went about their daily struggles with characteristic resilience. These were the people whose future he was being asked to mortgage. "I appreciate China's generous offer," he said finally, turning back to face the ambassador. "But Burkina Faso's resources belong to the Burkinabe people. Any development must prioritize their benefit over foreign profit." Chen's expression tightened almost imperceptibly. "Of course, Mr. President, but consider the practical realities. Development requires capital and expertise that currently exist outside your borders. Ideology cannot extract minerals or build refineries." "Perhaps not," Traoré agreed. "But neither can ideology justify trading one form of dependency for another." After the ambassador's departure, Traoré touched the pendant through his shirt, feeling its warmth return like a gentle affirmation. The first test had been passed, but he sensed greater challenges ahead. The second trial arrived within days, carried by his own intelligence chief in a folder marked with the highest security classification. General Bambara, a loyalist from Traoré's military days, entered the presidential office with the grim expression of one bearing terrible news. "Sir, we've uncovered evidence of a conspiracy," Bambara announced, opening the folder to reveal photographs, transcripts, and surveillance reports. "Multiple opposition figures are planning coordinated actions against your administration. Some appear to have foreign backing." Traoré examined the documents with growing unease. The evidence seemed substantial. Recorded conversations, financial transfers, meeting schedules that suggested organized resistance to his government. But something about the presentation troubled him. "What do you recommend?" he asked, though the pendant was already growing cold against his chest. "Immediate arrests," Bambara replied without hesitation. "We can move tonight, before they have a chance to implement whatever they're planning. Preventive detention, at minimum. Exile would be safer." "Based on conversations and meetings," Traoré challenged, "without evidence of actual crimes." "Sir, in situations like this, waiting for crimes to be committed means waiting for your own assassination," the general pressed. "Sankara himself might be alive today if he had acted preemptively against Compaoré's plotting." The argument was seductive, particularly coming from a trusted ally who genuinely feared for Traoré's safety. But the pendant's chill warned him that this path led toward the very oppression he had fought to overcome. "General," Traoré said slowly, "file these reports for monitoring purposes. Increase security around government facilities, but no arrests without evidence of actual criminal activity." "Sir, I must strongly advise—" "Your advice is noted," Traoré interrupted firmly. "But we will not become the thing we fought to replace." Bambara left visibly frustrated, and Traoré knew he had created tension with a valuable ally. But the pendant's returning warmth suggested he had chosen correctly, even if the immediate consequences were uncomfortable. The third and most crucial test arrived exactly as Mariama had predicted, 3 months after his visit to Bangassé, during a period when the seasonal rains had failed to materialize. Burkina Faso faced potential drought, economic pressure from international partners, and growing uncertainty about the young president's leadership. It was then that his closest advisors presented what they called the stabilization proposal. "Mr. President," his chief of staff began during what had been scheduled as a routine briefing, "we need to discuss the practical realities of governance in times of crisis." The proposal was elegant in its logic and devastating in its implication. Rather than risk potential instability through immediate democratic transitions, they suggested gradually extending the current military administration's mandate, not indefinitely, just long enough to address the security crisis, implement economic reforms, and build the infrastructure necessary for effective democracy. "The people trust you personally," his communications director added. "Rushing toward elections before we've solved their immediate problems would be irresponsible." As they spoke, Traoré felt the pendant growing colder against his chest, the chill spreading through his body like ice water in his veins. Everything they said made rational sense, but every word carried him further from the revolutionary principles that had brought him to power. "How long?" he asked quietly. 5 years, perhaps 7, his chief of staff replied. "Long enough to establish lasting foundations for prosperity and security. 7 years. Long enough to become everything he had sworn to oppose." That night, alone in his private quarters, Traoré held the pendant in his hands and felt its bitter cold seep into his bones. The rational arguments of his advisors echoed in his mind: stability, security, the need for gradual change in a volatile region. Yet beneath their logic lay the same justifications that had sustained decades of authoritarian rule across Africa. He thought of Mariama's weathered face, her blind eyes that seemed to see more clearly than his own vision. "True revolution is not the seizure of power, but its transformation," she had said. The words carried weight that grew heavier with each passing hour. By dawn, his decision was made. The announcement came without fanfare during a televised address to the nation. Sitting behind the simple desk he had chosen to replace his predecessor's ornate furnishings, Traoré spoke directly to his fellow citizens with characteristic directness. 18 months ago, I assumed the responsibility of leadership during our nation's hour of crisis, he began. Today, I announce the beginning of our transition back to civilian democracy. The words sent shock waves through political circles, both domestic and international. His advisors, expecting the stabilization announcement they had crafted, sat in stunned silence in the broadcasting studio. Effective immediately, we will convene a national constitutional convention comprising representatives from every province, every ethnic group, every sector of our society, Traoré continued. Within 24 months, Burkina Faso will hold free and fair elections for a new civilian government. At Crom, he paused, feeling the pendant warm against his chest for the first time in weeks. I will not be a candidate in those elections. The last statement created an uproar that reached far beyond Burkina Faso's borders. International observers, accustomed to African military leaders who clung to power indefinitely, struggled to interpret this unprecedented voluntary abdication. But Traoré wasn't finished. However, my commitment to our nation's transformation does not end with this transition. I hereby establish the Sankara Institute for Democratic Leadership, a foundation dedicated to supporting genuine democracy throughout Africa. This institute will be funded by the lithium revenues that rightfully belong to our people, not to foreign corporations or corrupt officials. In the days that followed, the true scope of his transformation became clear. Rather than accepting the Chinese lithium deal or similar offers from other powers, Traoré announced a revolutionary approach. Burkina Faso would develop its mineral resources through a sovereign wealth fund, with profits directly funding education, healthcare, and infrastructure for ordinary citizens. We will not trade our resources for temporary security, he declared at a press conference, nor will we mortgage our children's future for today's convenience. The international reaction was swift and polarized. Some praised his unprecedented commitment to democratic principles, while others warned of the chaos that might follow his departure from power. But within Burkina Faso, something extraordinary began to happen. Citizens who had grown cynical about political promises found themselves believing again. Young people organized civic education campaigns. Traditional leaders offered their support for the Constitutional Convention. Even opposition figures who had been prepared for persecution found themselves invited to participate in designing the new democratic framework. 6 months after his transformative announcement, Traoré made an unannounced return to Bangassé. He found the village much as he had left it, though the residents' faces showed a new sense of hope and purpose. Most importantly, he found Mariama still alive, sitting beneath her favorite baobab tree, as if she had been waiting for his return. "You chose well, child," she said simply as he approached. "The pendant no longer burns cold against your heart." Traoré smiled, touching the artifact that had become both burden and guide. "It feels warm again. But I confess, grandmother, I fear what comes next. Leading change is difficult, but stepping aside while change continues may be harder still." "That fear proves you have learned wisdom," Mariama replied. "The truly revolutionary act is not taking power, but demonstrating that power can be voluntarily surrendered for the greater good." She gestured toward the horizon, where the first substantial rains in months were building in towering cumulus clouds. "You have broken the cycle that has trapped our continent for generations. Others will follow your example, not because you forced them to, but because you showed them it was possible." Nature, as if summoned by her words, a delegation of young people from across West Africa arrived in Bangassé that very day. They had come to learn from both the ancient wisdom keeper and the president who had chosen principle over power. The village that had been forgotten by the world suddenly found itself at the center of a new movement, one that sought to transform leadership across the continent. "The spirits showed me this too," Mariama confided as they watched the young activists engage in passionate discussions about democratic governance and authentic development. "Your choice would inspire others to make similar choices. Not immediately, perhaps, but over time." 2 years later, Burkina Faso held its promised elections. The campaign was spirited but peaceful, with multiple candidates offering competing visions for the country's future. Traoré kept his word, remaining on the sidelines while providing technical support through the Sankara Institute. On election day, he cast his ballot as an ordinary citizen, then returned to his modest home to wait for the results with quiet satisfaction. The pendant, which he still wore but no longer needed to guide his decisions, rested warm and light against his chest, a reminder of the moment when prophecy and choice had converged to change the course of a nation. The young democracy that emerged was not perfect, but it was genuine. More importantly, it served as a beacon for other African nations, where young leaders began to question whether the old patterns of governance truly served their people. Mariama passed away peacefully that December, her mission finally complete. At her funeral, leaders from across the continent gathered not to mourn the end of her remarkable life, but to celebrate the beginning of the transformation she had helped set in motion. Her final words, spoken to Traoré just days before her death, captured the essence of what they had accomplished together. Revolution is not an event, child. It is a choice made again and again, generation after generation. You have taught a new generation to choose wisely. The pendant was buried with her, its purpose fulfilled, but the changes it had helped inspire would ripple across Africa for decades to come, proof that prophecy and courage, when combined, could indeed transform the world.